Alvin Augustus Lucier Jr. was born in 1931 in New Hampshire in a family of amateur musicians. His father had studied the violin with a member of the Boston Symphony, but chose to become a lawyer professionally, and was the mayor of Nashua from 1934 to 37. It was an affluent family. They sang and played music together. Music was never frowned upon as an amateur activity. Quite the opposite. Alvin felt, and he suspected his sisters shared this view, that Alvin Sr. might have had better luck in music than in politics. Like, most people aren't mayor, I get that, but Alvin Sr.'s ambitions were higher. He tried running for congressional seats and lost every time. Alvin Jr. might have followed down this legal path if not for his stutter, which he had throughout his entire life. The Luciers, although musical, only went as far as about Gershwin when it came to classical music. Alvin leapfrogged this. He recalled going to a music store in Nashua called Nutting's, where he bought a recording of Arnold Schoenberg's Serenade, and he just got bowled over. He also fell in love with the music of Beethoven and Johannes Brahms, and early on developed a love of 16th century counterpoint. His parents always worried that he didn't have enough piano training to do well. His first musical ambition was in jazz, and it seemed like he wanted to become a jazz drummer for a time. He never studied in high school, and he actually had to take a year at prep school just to get his grades up, and so his mom sent him off to Portsmouth Priory in 1949, a boarding school run by the Benedictines. This worked, and Alvin Jr. had his choice of school. Alvin Sr. wanted that Dartmouth legacy, and Jr. got in, but Yale also accepted him, and Yale had a school of music. He played cymbals in the marching band. He also took some law classes. He recalled figuring out when his professor would call on all the L last names for some presentation in his constitutional law class, so he could skip that class, because the thought of being in front of his classmates with his stutter just terrified him. He wouldn't have been a good trial lawyer, let's just put it that way. After graduating, Lucier stayed at Yale and continued on into their graduate program in music, but that program just wasn't for him, and he dropped out after 1 year. He found himself working at a New Haven department store, and kept in contact with his friends who were still at Yale. One of them, Stanley Mills, was a biochemist who had just gotten an offer to do postdoctoral work at one of the nation's newest schools, Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, whose music department at that time boasted Arthur Berger, Irving Fine, and Harold Shapiro. Before matriculating, he went to Tanglewood for the first time, and all of this opened his eyes and ears to the landscape of modern music. At that point, his music had a very neoclassical bent, always with a direct language. But there was something about that style that seemed off. Not him. Not artistically fulfilling. Lucier went to Italy on a Fulbright, intent on indulging his neoclassical side by going full neo-baroque and writing variations for trumpet and harpsichord on a piece by Monteverdi. This piece never materialized. Almost as soon as he got there, he attended a concert in Venice, where John Cage, David Tudor, Merce Cunningham, and Carolyn Brown performed a Cage theater piece called Music Walk with Dancers. Time magazine would call this concert a typically mad melange of musical hijinks. Fights broke out, and, according to the Time Review, an old man got up from the audience to wail on the piano with his cane, shouting about how this made him a musician too. But in Italian, I would assume. For Lucier, it was a transformative experience. It was a shock, he said. It was wonderful and was very influential in changing my attitude. Or so he said nearly 30 years later. At the time, he said, he stopped composing music for a year and just ate pasta. You can't blame him for that. He spent most of his time in Rome, where he grew estranged from traditional instrumental music, but had no clue what his path forward ought to be. One of these attempts was 1962's action music, which has detailed diagrams of the gestures that the pianist should make through time, rather than the resulting notes. When Lucier returned from his Fulbright that same year, he was hired at Brandeis to conduct their chamber chorus, which did a wide smattering of music. One of his hats was coordinating visiting artists, so he reached out to John Cage to see if he wanted to come and do a solo show just up the hill at the Rose Art Museum. Cage agreed to the show. He didn't agree to the solo. He wanted to make the performance more local to the area, specifically with works by Harvard professor Christian Wolff and Brandeis faculty member Alvin Lucier. Lucier objected that he didn't have anything ready. His entire time at Brandeis as a faculty member had been of creative drift. It was an aversion to instrumental music, but no idea of what to do instead. Tape pieces were too precise. They were the same thing all the time. He didn't even like the sound of Brandeis' in-house synthesizer, an ARP 2600, so, not a bad model at all. He just didn't like electronically produced sound. The timbre had no life. But Lucier told Cage he'd been working on this one project, and it was about brainwaves. Lucier had a friend on the faculty over in the physics department named Edmund Dewan. And Dewan had been hired by the U.S. Air Force to research epilepsy in their pilots at nearby Hanscom Air Force Base. Dewan told Lucier about alpha waves, these extremely low-frequency brain waves that I still don't think anyone really knows for sure how or why these form, even today. But what Dewan knew even then was that people could affect their alpha waves by shutting their eyes and, in essence, just doing less thinking, putting themselves into a meditative state. These brainwaves, Lucier's colleagues back in the music department said, ooh, you can magnify them and you can process them and you can put them on tape and you can make a really cool tape piece out of it. And so they really wanted him to make a tape piece out of these brainwaves, and Lucier thought about this, he considered it, and he also considered about why he thought it was a bad idea. And what he realized is that the magic of music was not in the sound. It was in the performance, the act of playing. So he borrowed Dewan's equipment, took it into the electronic music studio, and tried his best to massively amplify the signals coming out of the electrodes and use bursts of alpha waves to do something musical. Less composition, more sonification. Trouble is, he told Cage, he couldn't get this technology to work consistently. The best solution that he came up with was to borrow a bunch of amplifiers from different people and then link them together in a chain, output to input, and that runs the risk of something blowing out, or blowing up, for that matter. Cage said that whether or not he could get it to work, that didn't actually matter. It was the performance that mattered, whether or not it worked. So they set something up in the museum. Cage was Lucier's assistant. The resulting piece became known as Music for Solo Performer, the first piece of Lucier's mature style. It was Lucier's first attempt at an indeterminate experimental text score, which, the night before the premiere, sort of embarrassed him. He thought that composition was the imposition of structure onto sound, and he had no structure in mind. He and Cage couldn't even agree on how long the piece ought to be. Cage suggested 40 minutes, which mortified Lucier. The score, Lucier explained, specifies a task to be accomplished, not a composer's idea of a fixed object. Lucier set up an environment where the performer has to get on stage with electrodes attached and somehow overcome stage fright to reach a meditative state, which would activate the sound. Enormously amplified bursts of waves would, once detected, get sent out to loudspeakers sitting on various objects, usually percussion instruments, but also things like cardboard boxes. In the studio, Lucier had noticed that the rapid motion of the loudspeaker cones was more interesting than the frequencies they produced, hence setting them in places to hit percussion instruments. Alpha waves are so low in frequency that they're practically just rhythm anyway. Lucier referred to this as music without compositional manipulation or purposeful performance. When he performed music for Solo Performer, he tried to put his brain in the blank contemplative space he had seen in Trappist monks who had come to pray at his old boarding school when their monastery had burned down. There are some obvious overlaps with Cage. Both of these composers de-center the composer. Performers' choices are determined by chance at some level. In both, the composer's role is to define the circumstances under which a performance can happen. And they're both inspired by performance art to varying extents. But Lucier's work has something to say about the physical reality of sound in specific spaces, and of our relationship to that sound. Lucier's best work teaches something about the nature of sound to its performers and its listeners. Cage's belief in all sound's ability to be music makes his work a little more detached and objective. Lucier's music is about the subjective experience of individuals and groups in relationship to their environment, and also about the physical facts of how sound works in spaces. Cage's work is more like a bunch of philosophical thought experiments in compositional form. Lucier is trying to teach us something practical about physics and human perception. Music for Solo Performer launched Lucier into a series of performance art pieces that, for years, lacked definitive versions. They were text scores in the sense that they described the creation of a situation, of an environment where a piece would unfold. The versions that existed prior to publication were more like tech sheets. As late as 1972, the score to Music for Solo Performer was a rental kit that contained the tech and directions for its use. It would take years of workshopping before Lucier could distill a piece into its final form. The final scores are more about ideas than they are about technical specifics. He figured that anyone interested in doing one of his pieces would have the technical knowledge to figure that side out. It was, ironically, never his strong suit. James Tenney described Lucier's music not as composed, but as designed. In 1966, he joined forces with three other similarly minded composer-performers, Robert Ashley, David Behrman, and Gordon Mumma. They called themselves the Sonic Arts Union, and by pooling their resources, knowledge, and equipment, each member benefited. They were always down to help each other with performance or technology, but they were not a unified block or marketing gimmick, like the Mighty Handful or Les Six from prior generations. Ashley and Mumma were based out of Michigan, where they ran an independent electronic music studio, as it wasn't affiliated with an institution like a university. Lucier said he could barely read a circuit diagram. Mumma and Behrman taught themselves not just how to read the diagrams, but how to build circuits. 2 years after the formation of the Sonic Arts Union, Lucier took a job at Wesleyan University, which retains a reputation as a hub of experimental music. He was an institution there, officially staying until 2011, and remaining a staple of artistic life on campus throughout the following decade. I hesitate to call Alvin Lucier a minimalist. His music does consist of singular, obvious, and long processes, so in that regard, he kind of is. And his work is visually striking, so there's a link to the Fluxus movement of performance art that birthed the first minimalists. Where Lucier differs is his focus on how sound interacts in particular spaces, how a process can reveal the acoustics of the environment. I'm sitting in a spare bedroom that's been converted into a library/studio space. If I go off and walk into the closet, you can probably already tell that my voice is changing a little bit. By the time I get in here, that change is noticeable and dramatic, even to me. You're probably noticing even more from your vantage point on this microphone. Different spaces sound different. This is a smaller room, and it's filled to the brim with super absorbent material. Now, the fact that different environments sound different has always been true. It's not usually been something that composers concern themselves with. You have interpreters who are going to make decisions to fit your piece into a certain space. Lucier's genius was not just thinking about this space when writing a piece, it was about making a piece that's entirely about this space. The singular piece that embodies Lucier's ethos in this regard is I Am Sitting in a Room, sparked by a chance run-in with his old buddy Edmund Dewan. Dewan had just attended an MIT lecture given by Amar Bose, who tested his loudspeakers by recycling sound through them to see if they were flat. He'd record the output and send it back through multiple times over. Flatness in this case being a realistic reproduction of the sound that went in, as opposed to one that artificially boosts or curbs any frequency. This piqued Lucier's curiosity. You might have a speaker with a flat enough response, and flatness is good in that case, but rooms are not flat. The size of the room, the materials in the room, subtly reinforce some frequencies and subtly cancel others out. Lucier experimented in one of the rooms at Brandeis, recording and playing back sounds over and over, just like Bose did. Now, I don't know whether it was the electronic music studio or just a random practice room. Truth is, if you compare some of the same stories that Lucier told over the years, books that were published in 1980 and 2012, some of the details in comparison get a little bit smudged. I choose to believe it's the studio because then I can say for sure that I've been in the room. But the truth is that it doesn't really matter which room it was in, because all of the small rooms in Schlossberg are functionally identical. And he called the studio a small, bright, and somewhat antiseptic room in which I never enjoyed being very much. The windowed walls and hard surfaces of these rooms reinforce too much, too fast during the audio recycling. After a few rounds, the rooms made the noises harsh and strident, because glass doesn't absorb sound that well. Lucier lucked out in his second try. Wesleyan had given him what he called a sorted habitat, an apartment at 454 High Street with absorbent acoustics, big drapes and a thick shag rug. Like, this was the late 60s, but clearly Wesleyan was ahead of the curve here because it sounds like the 70s were in Middletown. He borrowed 2 high-quality tape recorders, unplugged all of his appliances, shut off his radiator, and this was winter in Connecticut, so bold move, and he waited until the nearby bar had its last call. And he recorded a short description of what he was doing, played that back into the room, recorded that until he had done this 16 times, going well into the wee hours of the night, and probably spoiling whatever was in his fridge, but again, he also turned off the radiator, so I don't know. The score is a set of steps about how one would reenact the process. It has to be in a room that has musical qualities that the player would like to evoke. I don't intrude my personality on a space, Lucier said. Every time the recorded audio is re-recorded in the space, it gets a boost in the room's resonant frequencies and a dip in whatever frequencies happen to cancel out. Done over and over and over again, you eventually get a really beautiful soundscape that has little in common with the plain spoken text that began the piece. As you listen, slowly you lose the sense of text at all. You're not really listening to the performer. The performer just activates the room. You're listening to the room itself, through the performer.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. What you will hear then are the natural resonant frequencies of the room articulated by speech. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of a physical fact, but more as a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have. I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that any semblance of my speech, with perhaps the exception of rhythm, is destroyed. What you will hear are the natural resonant frequencies of the room articulated by speech. I regard this activity not so much as a demonstration of physical fact, but more as a way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have. I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again until the resonant frequencies of the room reinforce themselves, so that
And at some point you do get diminishing returns. One thing about Lucier's music is that, especially in this middle period from the mid-60s through the early 80s, he'll give you pieces with very audible processes that have no clearly defined endpoint. They'll either start off doing something, or they'll get themselves going after a while, and then will just go as long as the performers want. Honestly, most of these pieces work better as installations rather than as concert pieces. There's a similarity here to intentional degradation of digital compression, where saving and recompressing a file digitally slowly degrades the quality.
Do I look like I know what a JPEG is?
And Lucier's wife, at the time, was a visual artist who did the same thing with Polaroids. Lucier used tape as a means to capture an acoustic processing, an analog spectral filter. He made larger versions, he did it in bigger spaces, longer performances, he recorded and played back everyday sounds of multiple people, or even a full orchestra. But to him, there was always something magical about the original idea, not just because it was the first in a series of pieces that used the process, not because you could hear the process, all the pieces did that, it's because the text explained it. It was self-contained. Lucier's text scores show a profound understanding of the different ways performers and listeners relate to the spaces that they're in. Take Vespers, a piece that came to him in a dream, where a group of people explore a dark environment using echolocators. The resulting sound mimicking that of crickets, but with a title that refers to a family of bats and puns on the evening prayer from the divine office. Originally, Lucier specified the use of sondols, an expensive device made by a company called Listening Incorporated. This company once sent a report to the United States Navy about, and I kid you not, the technical specifications of a product that they made called the Man-to-Porpoise Translator MDT-5, built by a guy named Stephen L. Moshier, who went on to get a half-dozen patents in speech recognition in the 80s after Listening Inc. had gone belly up. Their main source of revenue seems to have been random government contracts to facilitate communication between humans and dolphins, and the sondols were a side result of that research. They gave out very directional sound pulses that could echo off just about anything. You could change the rate of the pulsations, but nothing else. Lucier got his hands on 4 of these sondols and constructed a piece where performers, their vision obscured by low light or blindfolds, have to find their way towards each other using echolocation. The sondols are good for this because they're directional, but they were hard to come by even when Listening Incorporated was a going concern. The openness of the scores lent itself quite nicely to versions with cheaper noisemakers, but even so, I'm aware of at least one composer who built imitation sondols for a performance of Vespers. It's just more effective that way. To perform Vespers, wrote Nicholas Collins, is to experience sound as survival, rather than as self-expression or mere entertainment. Maybe no surprise it found life in England in schools for the blind. Listening Inc. thought they'd be useful in that regard, and also for divers working in low-light situations. 2 more pieces, both from 1970, are novel twists on this idea of music and space. Hartford Memory Space asks the performers to go out, listen to the sounds of their environment, even record them if they want to for their own personal use, then to come back inside and do their best to recreate the sounds that they heard on their instruments. The piece title changes based on the performer's municipality. Hartford happened to be where the piece premiered, as it was also the site of where he first got the idea, after he caught a couple of guys trying to steal an amp from his trunk. Inspiration comes from the strangest places sometimes. The point was, as in Vespers, to educate the performers, to have them really scrutinize the sounds they encountered. The more you knew about acoustics, the better your recreations could be. In this period, this was his idea of writing for instruments, specifically for conservatory students. I wanted them to use what I think is almost an obsolete state of affairs, he said, referring to orchestral instruments. So many electronic composers imitate conventional instruments with electronic devices, and I was thinking of reversing the situation. Plenty of composers from the mid-60s onward wrote text scores. They're usually short. Sometimes they're downright cryptic. Lucier's scores of this period are a far cry from traditional notation, but they're not exactly the head-scratching aphorisms that most people think of when they hear the term text score. They're long and involved. He sets up who the piece is for and the many possible ways one can go about realizing it. Quasimodo the Great Lover is several dense pages, describing the exact manner in which it may be set up, and what sounds he wants sent over the resulting system. I like to think of this piece as a complicated version of I Am Sitting in a Room. He wants the effect of spatial reverberations, but done so across multiple spaces in one single go. Lucier sets up the conditions for a series of audio relays in different spaces, sending and receiving the audio from loudspeaker to microphone over and over in a bunch of separate locations, to set up a closer to real-time realization of music traveling in space. The sound is changed by each step in the relay. And, as you might imagine, the internet has made this piece much easier to realize. There's so much detail and specificity. There are examples and limitations in this score. Most text scores, like graphic scores, can have wildly different interpretations. In Lucier, fidelity to the score will de facto result in similar sounding pieces. Just like action music at the end of his first period, it's about as specific as you can get while you're not using notes. The last piece I'll mention in this section is Chambers. For a performance in New York City, where the performance spilled out onto 57th Street, the performers were playing a bunch of conch shells. Lucier described the result as a blending of the performance and the sounds on the street. Performers tuned not to each other, but to the sound of the traffic, and they became one. I was also struck, Lucier recalled, by how space intrudes its personality on the sounds that you produce. In other words, the space processes our sound, the space affects how we perform, the space affects every way in which we interact with music. I'm actually reminded of something that David Byrne writes about in his book How Music Works, which is his theory about environment as the chief determiner of what music evolves where. Like, big drum circles make sense in large outdoor spaces, but for Gothic cathedrals, unaccompanied melody works best. Lucier's work, in what I'm calling his middle period, seems to me to come in two interlocking strands. One, which we just covered, is the connection between music, musicians, and environments. The other strand is about visualizing sound waves themselves. In The Queen of the South, he sets up a performance environment where loose material can move around in response to sound, creating a crude visualizer. What sorts of things could the musicians choose to create? Well, Lucier did not believe in etc. to end a list, so I will quote one full paragraph from the score to The Queen of the South. Make musical activity, either to discover in real time the visual images characteristic of the identity of the performing ensemble with respect to the time and place of the performance, or make predetermined patterns including lattices, networks, labyrinths, flows, currents, rotations, bridges, streams, beams, heaps, eddies, dunes, honeycombs, imbrications, cells, textures, turbulences, vortices, layers, figure eights, lemniscates, spirals, rings, rivulets, trees, branches, poles, dendrites, bushes, balls, pigeon eggs, quadroids, tetragons, pentagons, hexagons, flowers, hollows, ramparts, figurines, walls, peaks, pillars, columns, volutes, anally, fishes, plates, ram's horns, crypts, spicules, worms, webs, clouds, storms, spherules, zebras, plumes, embryos, rills, buttes, mesas, groves, fountains, swastikas, mandalas, crowns, crosses, scapulas, beads, medallions, topologies of near or far environs, plaids, tweeds, road signs, floor pans, tapestries, diamonds, stars of David, gardens, corals, sunburst, faces, angels, wings, fans, brooms, gullies, washes, mosses, daisies, weaves, signs of the zodiac, almonds, clock faces, calendars, moons, planets, mirrors, demons, gems, stigmata, sanctuaries, playing fields, wheels, whales, palms, ferns, cypresses, blindfolds, lyres, urns, Adams and Eves, cisterns, sepulchres, tongues, dragons, toads, eagles, swans, fishes, dishes, rooms, tombs, hosts, hats, animal tracks, fossils, footprints, rugs, bones, and ghosts. It's like the side effects they warn you about at the end of a drug commercial. Most of these designs, he said, were lifted straight from a book called Cymatics by Hans Jenny, who coined the term to describe the visual phenomenon that Lucier wanted his players to pursue. Why would he write a score like this? Well, on one level, it's funny, and I think it was his sense of humor. He liked long lists and complicated and obscure puns. Quasimodo the Great Lover and the Duke of York are both punny titles, which he refused to divulge. I'm confident that Quasimodo was a play on the humpback whale, and whale songs are a point of departure for that piece, but I can't say I have any idea what the Great Lover part is about, so hit me up in the comments if you have a lead on that front. Another reason is that by giving players so much information, he could get players to be free, but not to improvise. He thought improvisation meant something to general audiences that the word didn't actually mean. He pointed out that, way back in the Baroque era, the practice of improvisation was based off of pre-existing formulas. By placing a player, or a group, into a situation where their abilities and their interactions are limited or visualized, like the Bunsen burner flame that flickers in patterns and Tyndall orchestrations, Lucier felt he was constraining players with natural materials, rather than constraining them to something he pre-envisioned. The strong visual element of his work goes all the way back to his very first text scores. But I think the most striking might actually be Music on a Long Thin Wire, which plays down the human element from Music for Solo Performer, or Vespers. Lucier asks for a long thin wire, the length of it more for visual purposes, since somehow the guy with the Brainwave piece didn't want to make this one seem like a science experiment. Long wires do sound better, more full in a context like this, but they can also be too long to work given the physics involved, so it's a little bit of a balancing act in that regard. This was another piece that came from a dream. Lucier said he dreamed of a wire reaching from the Earth to the Moon, inspired by a physics class he was co-teaching at Wesleyan. Which, the Moon is not in geosynchronous orbit, but Lucier wasn't an astrophysicist, and even if he was, you really can't fault a guy for having scientifically inaccurate dreams. In this piece, the wire is driven by a sine wave oscillator, and there's a magnet in the middle. The performer silently tunes the oscillator, then brings the volume up on both it and the amplifier, creating interesting patterns in the wire, before reducing the volume and resetting for the next pitch. Again, it's one of these pieces that has no built-in endpoint. Somehow automate the performer's role, and all of a sudden, it's an installation. Music on a Long Thin Wire shows Lucier's interest in generating music through pure acoustical phenomena. Aspects of this piece show how what we think of as these individual elements of sound, frequency, amplitude, timbre, interact with one another. Some frequencies are louder because they hit the wire's resonant frequency, which you can think of as the speed of vibration that a material really, really likes. Lucier pointed to 1982 as his turning point back towards acoustic instruments and specifying ensembles. I consider this the start of Lucier's third period. He didn't disown the text works. He felt that method was the only way he could get across certain ideas. But those were experimental, and there's only so much experimentation that can be done. This late period was not experimental, he said, because he was using instruments with known acoustical properties. He still focused on acoustics, not musical gestures. He cared about practicality, about being able to have other pieces on the same program. So he tried to stop his instrumental music after the 16-minute mark at most, unless he needed to finish out some process. I think it took Lucier a long while to get to a point where he felt comfortable using standard acoustic Western instruments in his particular practice. Because how do you use these and stay true to a single idea musical practice that explores this inner life of sound and the physical properties of sound waves themselves. Mostly, this was through the interaction of sine tones with soloists or ensembles. In Crossings, Lucier specifies a slowly rising sine tone that, as it traverses the pitch space, is met with acoustic instruments playing in almost unisons. As the sine tone rises, beating sounds are produced by these slightly off frequencies. It's a rhythmic warbling that, to my ears, kind of sits behind the front of the music. The rhythm in Lucier's music is never directly on the surface, and in this era, it really just comes from the beating that happens when you put two sounds next to each other that are only a few hertz apart. For instance, if I set up an oscillator at 440 hertz and another at 439 hertz, there's a 1 hertz difference, 1 cycle per second, and you can hear that resulting difference. Now, it's too low to be heard as a true difference tone. 1 hertz is a rhythm as opposed to a pitch, but it's still measured in frequency. This was part of his shift in that decade to a rapprochement with traditional concert music, and the idea was pretty fruitful. Lucier was never a rhythmic composer, but he was fascinated with how pitch could be used to create rhythm inside the texture, how he could create shifting pulsations just through acoustics. The core idea in Crossings was recycled a number of different times. He did one for solo clarinet in Memoriam John Higgins. He did one for ensemble in his septet for 3 winds, 4 strings, and pure wave oscillator, and for timpani and 2 oscillators in kettles. Now, the waves didn't have to move either. In 1986, as a tribute to James Tenney, the sine waves don't sweep around the pitch space. Instead, there's a slow-moving counterpoint as the bassist plays notes that beat against these pure waves. Lucier's music also explores the ways in which you can get similar effects without always having to rely on sine tones to generate your steady pitches. This technique involved outlines of geometric designs, traced directly into the score, usually abstract shapes. In Diamonds, multiple orchestras slowly traced diamond shapes with slowly evolving pitches, a simple concept slightly offset from different iterations of itself, resulting in interference patterns not dissimilar to that of his sine wave and ensemble music. In Shadow Lines, he gets beats from an oddball ensemble where 3 strings sweep through a major third, and 2 winds take the part of the steady tones. But given that human performers are not the best at holding slightly different pitches from one another, most of these pieces are going to have sine waves, even if there's also some traced design, such as in 6 Geometries, where he took 6 images from William Carlos Williams' poems and had sine waves and a chorus do the same patterns, creating beats along the way. Originally, he wanted the chorus to also sing the texts, but that got in the way of what he was really after, which was all that juicy, juicy beating. Sometimes the tracings were more complicated. In his Panorama series, the sweeps of the trombone's slide trace outlines of specific mountain ranges, while other instruments try to follow this line as best that they can. And in Still Lives, Lucier traced 8 random objects he had around his house, including a bread knife, some ferns, and his grill. And in Charles Curtis, named after its dedicatee and first performer, the sine tones draw 2 C's in pitch space for Charles and Curtis. Curtis said that Lucier was concerned with wavelength and not frequency, which are the same thing, or like they're 2 ways of measuring the same thing. Frequency measures how fast the sound hits the listener, how many full compressions and rarefactions you hear in 1 second. Wavelength makes you think about sound as a physical phenomenon in space, something tangible, something real. Frequency is pitch characterized as a fast rhythm. Wavelength is pitch characterized by the space it inhabits. Unsurprising that Lucier never thought in terms of pitch classes. Not all Cs were the same because each had a different wavelength. So in Slices, the cello and orchestra trade off all 53 notes of the cello's range, or what Lucier determined was the cello's range. As the cellist plays, notes fall away from the orchestral cluster, and once they're silent, each new pitch of the cello activates that same pitch somewhere in the orchestra. There's a funny story of Lucier experiencing some balance problems when he was working on the first performance of this, and he made some comment about how it would just be so nice if he could go back to working with do re mi. As he moved into the late 90s and then into the 21st century, he relied less and less on electronics. He said he ran short of piece ideas because performers kept asking for pieces and he couldn't bring himself to say no. Lucier was happy to dip back into older ideas if doing so made sense, hence all those sine wave pieces. In Silver Streetcar for the Orchestra, Lucier asks a percussionist playing an amplified triangle to dampen the triangle with one hand and tap it with another. By adjusting the position of each hand as well as the nature of the tapping, Lucier invites an exploration into the interior sound of the triangle, as though it were a small physical space in its own right. And though from the third period, it is a text score. Since he was writing for instruments, he also got to apply his technique from I Am Sitting in a Room to large ensembles on multiple occasions. Exploration of the House reworks Beethoven's overture, The Consecration of the House, into small fragments, which are then recorded and played back into the room, yada yada yada. Alvin Lucier remained a vibrant part of the American experimental music scene until his death in December 2021. Lucier succeeded in his goal of putting people into harmonious relationships with natural phenomena. But in some cases, Lucier's music is far more intimate. He explores the relationships between people. In The Duke of York, two members of a duo co-create a duet where a synthesizer alters the human voice, which grew out of an idea which kind of reads like Lucier's idea of marriage counseling, where he and his then-wife Mary would grow closer sonically. Not sure how well that worked out because, again, that divorce did happen, but he got a piece out of it, which he thought of as not his opera, but more accurately an attempt to fix opera's stereotypical conflicts, where tragedy occurs due to mistaken identity or miscommunication, some variety of not really knowing each other. And in Lucier's music, knowledge is so important. Knowledge is everything. Knowing what sound you can make that make a flame flutter, sand move around in just the right way. Knowing every micro variation in sound between you and some sine wave. Knowing just by sound where the heck you are in space. Lucier thought of his work as, I won't say a fusion between science and art, but actually he didn't see a difference between those two things. Art was science, and science was art. He never had success limiting himself just to his artistic side. And he was very aware that of all the things composers usually like as inspirations, he felt moved by exactly none of them. It was only when he discovered his knack for harnessing natural phenomena that he found his niche, the rich, intentional, experimental universe of sound and space that Joan LaBarbera called Supermusic. If I wanted to clickbait, I could call this my coming out of the closet video.